Robert Wilson parked his black Mercedes in the driveway of his two-story home in the wealthy neighborhood of Brentwood, Los Angeles. The evening sun cast long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawn as he grabbed his leather briefcase from the passenger seat. Another successful day at the office had ended. At 45, Robert had built a life that many people dreamed of but few achieved. He walked through the front door and breathed in the smell of dinner cooking. His wife Diane was in the kitchen, her back turned to him as she stirred something on the stove. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the pearl necklace he had given her for their 15th anniversary just 3 months ago. "I'm home," Robert called out, placing his keys in the small crystal bowl on the entryway table. Diane turned around, her face lighting up with a smile. "Just in time. Dinner's almost ready." Robert kissed her cheek and loosened his tie. Their routine was comfortable and predictable. Every weekday he came home around 6. They ate dinner together, talked about their day, and sometimes watched TV before bed. On weekends they hosted dinner parties for friends or attended charity events where Robert networked with other successful businessmen. "How was your meeting with the investors?" Diane asked as she placed a plate of grilled salmon in front of him. "Good, very good," Robert said. "They like the plans for the new shopping center in Pasadena. We should have the contracts signed by next week." Diane nodded, clearly proud of her husband's success. She had been there from the beginning, when Robert was just starting out in real estate. She had supported him through the early struggles, the long hours, the risky investments. Now they enjoyed the rewards together. The beautiful home, the luxury cars, the vacation house in Malibu, the respect of their social circle. But lately, a strange feeling had been growing inside Robert. A restlessness he couldn't explain, a sense that something was missing. As he looked at his wife across the dinner table, talking about her day at the charity foundation where she volunteered, he felt a distance between them that hadn't been there before. Later that night, as Diane slept peacefully beside him, Robert stared at the ceiling. Their lives had become so structured, so predictable. Each day blended into the next with no surprises, no excitement. Was this all there was? Working, making money, attending social events, growing old together in comfortable silence. The next morning, Robert dressed in one of his expensive suits and checked himself in the mirror. His dark hair was beginning to gray at the temples, but he still looked good for his age. Fit, handsome, successful. He straightened his tie and practiced his confident smile, the one that closed deals and charmed clients. "I have a conference downtown today," he told Diane as he sipped his coffee. "Might run late. Don't wait up." The real estate conference at the Millennium Biltmore Hotel was like dozens he had attended before. Men and women in business attire discussed property values, market trends, and investment opportunities. Robert gave his presentation on commercial development, shook hands, exchanged business cards. By evening, he was tired of talking about business and decided to have a drink at the hotel bar before heading home. The bar was dimly lit and not too crowded. Robert loosened his tie and ordered a whiskey. He wasn't ready to go back to his perfect, predictable life just yet. As he took a sip of his drink, he didn't know that his decision to stay for just one more would change everything. He didn't know that in less than 24 hours, he would take the first step down a path that would eventually lead to lies, betrayal, and death. Robert swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the other guests at the hotel bar. Businessmen and women unwound after a long day of meetings, their laughter growing louder as the evening wore on. He checked his watch. It was already past 9, and he should head home. Diane would be wondering where he was, but something kept him in his seat, a reluctance to return to the predictable rhythm of his life. "Can I get you another?" The voice came from his left. Robert turned to see a young woman behind the bar. She wore the hotel's standard black uniform, but somehow made it look stylish. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and her smile seemed genuine, not the practiced politeness of most service workers. "Sure," Robert said, sliding his empty glass toward her. "Why not?" As she poured his drink, Robert found himself studying her. She couldn't be older than 25 or 26. There was something refreshing about her presence, an energy that the people in his usual social circle lacked. "Rough day?" she asked, placing the fresh whiskey in front of him. "No, actually, good day. Just not ready to go home yet." She raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. I'm Jessica, by the way. Robert, he replied, deliberately leaving off his last name. Without thinking, he slipped his left hand beneath the bar, hiding his wedding ring. You don't seem like a career bartender. Jessica laughed. I'm not. This is just paying the bills while I try to get my interior design business off the ground. Interior design? I'm in real estate development. Her eyes lit up. Really? That's actually perfect. I've been trying to make connections in that world. The conversation flowed easily after that. Robert found himself telling Jessica about his current projects, and she shared her dreams of designing spaces that were both beautiful and functional. When she wasn't serving other customers, she returned to his end of the bar. Each time she smiled at him, Robert felt a spark of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. My shift ends in 20 minutes, Jessica said as the bar began to empty. There's a late-night coffee shop around the corner. They have great pie. Robert knew he should decline. He should go home to his wife, but instead he heard himself say, I could use some coffee. The coffee shop was small and dimly lit, with only a few other customers. In a booth at the back, Robert and Jessica continued their conversation. He found himself fascinated by her passion for design, her stories about growing up in a small town outside of Portland, her determination to make it in Los Angeles despite the challenges. What about you? Married? Kids? Jessica asked casually, taking a bite of apple pie. The question caught Robert off guard. His wedding ring was now safely tucked in his pocket. He hesitated only briefly before answering. No, never found the right person, I guess. Work always came first. The lie came easily, surprising him. But in this moment with this woman, Robert didn't want to be the responsible husband. He wanted to be someone else, someone free from obligations and expectations. As they left the coffee shop, the night air was cool against Robert's face. Jessica stood close to him on the sidewalk, looking up at the tall buildings around them. I had a nice time tonight, she said. It's not often I meet someone who actually listens when I talk about design. I'd like to see your work sometime, Robert said. Maybe I could help you make some connections. Jessica smiled and pulled out her phone. Give me your number. As Robert recited his cell number, not his office line that Diane sometimes answered, he felt a mixture of excitement and guilt. He knew he was crossing a line, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. I'll text you, Jessica said, slipping her phone back into her purse. Maybe we can get together again soon. She leaned forward and kissed his cheek, her perfume lingering as she pulled away. Robert watched her walk toward the parking garage, his heart beating faster than it had in years. Driving home that night, Robert told himself it was just a friendly conversation, just networking. But deep down, he knew better. Something had changed. A door had opened, and he had willingly stepped through it. 3 days passed before Jessica texted Robert. He was in a meeting when his phone buzzed, and he felt his heart jump when he saw her name on the screen. Coffee tomorrow? 2 p.m. at Silver Lake Cafe. The message was simple, but it made his palms sweat. He waited an hour before replying, not wanting to seem too eager. See you there, he wrote back. That night, Robert told Diane he had a site visit the next afternoon. The lie felt heavier this time, more deliberate. As Diane kissed him goodbye the next morning, guilt twisted in his stomach. But it wasn't enough to stop him. The Silver Lake Cafe was far from Robert's office and even farther from his home in Brentwood. There was little chance he would run into anyone he knew. Jessica was already there when he arrived, sitting at a small table by the window. The sunlight caught in her dark hair, making it shine. She wore a simple blue dress that made her look both professional and beautiful. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said as he sat down across from her. Why wouldn't I? Robert asked, trying to sound casual. Jessica shrugged. Successful men like you are usually all talk, promise to help, then disappear. I'm not like that, Robert said, and he meant it. Even as he lied about his marriage, he genuinely wanted to help her with her career. He told himself this was why he was here. Professional mentoring, networking, nothing more. But as they talked, their knees touched under the small table. Jessica's laugh made him lean closer to hear it again. When she showed him photos of her design work on her phone, their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. By the time they finished their coffee, the pretense of a professional meeting had faded. My apartment isn't far from here, Jessica said. I could show you my portfolio. The real one, not just photos on a phone. Robert knew what would happen if he went with her. He knew he should make an excuse and leave, but he found himself following her down 3 blocks to a small apartment building with peeling paint and a security door that stuck when she pushed it open. Jessica's apartment was tiny but bright, with plants on every windowsill and colorful artwork on the walls. "It's not much," she said, "but the rent is cheap." Robert barely heard her. His heart was pounding as she set her purse down and turned to face him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Jessica stepped forward and kissed him, and all of Robert's doubts and guilt faded away. Hours later, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jessica's bed, Robert checked his watch and cursed. "I have to go," he said, reaching for his clothes. "Dinner meeting." Jessica watched him dress, not asking questions about where he was going or who he was meeting. As he leaned down to kiss her goodbye, she caught his face in her hands. "When will I see you again?" A week later, they met at a hotel. The week after that, at her apartment again. Soon, Robert was seeing Jessica at least twice a week. He invented business trips, late meetings, weekend conferences, anything to create time with her. He bought her expensive gifts: a gold bracelet, designer shoes, a new laptop for her design work. He introduced her to colleagues who might hire her, careful to present her as a talented designer he had discovered, nothing more. With Jessica, Robert felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. She was spontaneous, passionate, full of dreams and ideas. She made him feel young again, powerful, desired. When he was with her, he could forget the pressure of his work, the routine of his marriage, the endless social obligations. But as summer turned to fall, Robert began to struggle with his double life. Sometimes he called Diane by Jessica's name, catching himself just in time. Once he almost forgot an anniversary dinner because he was with Jessica. He was sleeping poorly, jumping whenever his phone rang, constantly checking his text messages. And Jessica was changing too. At first she had asked no questions about his life outside their time together, but lately she wanted more time, more attention, more of him. "I hate when you leave," she would say, holding on to him as he dressed to go home. "Stay longer. Call in sick tomorrow." Robert knew he was in too deep, but he couldn't pull away. Jessica had become like a drug to him, something he craved even as it slowly destroyed him, and as October arrived with its cooler nights, he had no idea how dangerous his addiction would soon become. Jessica called Robert 3 times during his anniversary dinner with Diane. He felt his phone vibrate in his pocket but couldn't answer. Across the table at the expensive restaurant, Diane raised her glass of champagne. "To 15 wonderful years," she said, smiling, "and many more to come." Robert forced a smile and clinked his glass against hers. The guilt that had become his constant companion grew heavier. Diane looked beautiful tonight in her black dress, her blonde hair swept up elegantly. She had been talking about a charity event she was organizing, but Robert had barely heard a word. His mind was with Jessica. Later that night, after Diane had fallen asleep, Robert checked his messages in the bathroom. 3 texts from Jessica, each more urgent than the last. "Call me." "Why aren't you answering?" "I need to talk to you now." Robert's hands shook slightly as he called her. "What's wrong?" he whispered into the phone. "Where were you?" Jessica's voice was tight with anger. "I waited all night." Robert closed his eyes. He had completely forgotten their plans to meet. "I'm sorry. Work emergency? Couldn't get away." "You're lying." Jessica's voice cracked. "I drove by your office. Your car wasn't there." A cold feeling spread through Robert's chest. "You drove by my office? Why would you do that?" "Because I knew you were lying." Jessica was crying now. "You're always lying. Where were you tonight? Who were you with?" Robert leaned against the bathroom door, keeping his voice low. "Jessica, we talked about this. I have other obligations, other parts of my life that—" "What other parts?" Jessica interrupted. "You never talk about them. Who is she, Robert?" The question hung in the air between them. Robert had been so careful to keep his 2 lives separate, but now they were colliding. "There's no one," he lied again. "I just need space sometimes, you know that." Jessica was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was calmer, which somehow frightened Robert more than her anger. "I think you need to come over tomorrow. We need to talk." The next day, Robert told Diane he had to check on a property development in Orange County. Instead, he drove to Jessica's apartment, his stomach tight with dread. When she opened the door, her eyes were red from crying, but she seemed oddly composed. I found something interesting yesterday, she said, leading him into her tiny living room. On the coffee table was a magazine, Los Angeles Society, a glossy publication that covered events in the city's wealthy neighborhoods. Jessica picked it up and opened to a marked page. Look familiar? Robert's blood ran cold. It was a photo from a charity gala 6 months ago. There he was, in a tuxedo, with Diane on his arm. The caption read, "Real estate developer Robert Wilson and wife Diane at the Children's Hospital benefit." "You're married." Jessica's voice was flat. "You've been married for 15 years. Your wife runs a foundation for children with cancer. You live in Brentwood in a house worth $4 million. She tossed the magazine back on the table. Did I miss anything? Robert sat down heavily on the couch. There was no point denying it now. Jessica, Don't. She cut him off. Don't say you're sorry. Don't say you were going to tell me. Just tell me why. Why lie about something so basic? Robert ran a hand through his hair. I didn't plan this, That first night at the bar, I just wanted to feel free. And then it became real. And I didn't know how to tell you without losing you. Jessica laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. So instead you built our entire relationship on a lie. She sat across from him, her eyes hard. I'm in love with you, Robert. I thought you loved me too. I thought we had a future. I do care about you, Robert said, reaching for her hand. She pulled away. It's complicated. My life is complicated. Jessica stood up and walked to the window, her back to him. I've been offered a design job in New York. I was going to turn it down because of you. She turned to face him. But now I'm thinking maybe I should take it. Start fresh. Robert felt panic rise in his chest. The thought of Jessica leaving made it hard to breathe. Despite everything, the lies, the complications, the guilt, he couldn't imagine his life without her now. Don't go, he said, standing up and crossing to her. Please. I'll figure something out. I just need time. Jessica looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. Time for what, Robert? To keep lying to everyone? To keep sneaking around? She shook her head. I want a real relationship. A whole life with someone, not just stolen afternoons and secret text messages. Robert pulled her close, desperate to hold on to her. I'll tell Diane. I'll end it. Just don't leave. Diane sat in her car outside Jessica's apartment building, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She had followed Robert here after he left the house that morning. For weeks she had suspected something was wrong. Robert had been distant, secretive with his phone, working late hours that didn't match the charges on their credit card statements. But she had never imagined this, her husband entering a rundown apartment building in a part of town he claimed to have no business in. 3 hours had passed. Diane had waited, thinking maybe this was a quick meeting, something innocent. But 3 hours was not innocent. She checked her watch again and took a deep breath. Then she got out of the car. The apartment building had no security system. Diane walked through the front door and checked the mailboxes in the lobby, looking for a name she recognized from Robert's contacts. Nothing stood out. She was about to leave when a young woman entered, carrying grocery bags. Excuse me, Diane said, forcing a friendly smile. I'm looking for Jessica Miller's apartment. I'm supposed to meet her about a design project. The woman pointed to the second floor, 2B. But she's with someone right now. She gave Diane a knowing look that made her stomach turn. Diane climbed the stairs slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Outside apartment 2B, she paused. She could hear voices inside. Robert's deep tone, then a woman's softer reply. Diane raised her hand to knock, then stopped. What would she say? What would she do? She pressed her ear to the door instead. Not that simple, Robert was saying. There's a house, our finances. It would take time to sort everything out. How much time? The woman, Jessica, sounded frustrated. You promised, Robert. I can't keep living like this. I know. Just give me a few more weeks. After the holidays would be better. Less painful for everyone. Less painful for you, you mean? Jessica's voice was bitter. What about me? What about the baby? Diane's breath caught in her throat. Baby? The word echoed in her mind like a gunshot. We don't know for sure yet, Robert said, his voice lower now. Let's wait for the test results before. I'm late, Robert, 3 weeks late. I've never been late before. Diane stepped back from the door, her legs suddenly weak. She needed to get out of there. As she turned to leave, her purse knocked against the door with a soft thud. The voices inside stopped. Footsteps approached. Diane ran down the hallway just as the door opened. She ducked around the corner to the stairwell, her heart racing. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. That night, when Robert came home, Diane was waiting in the living room. She had poured herself a glass of wine, something she rarely did in the afternoon. The evidence was laid out on the coffee table: credit card statements with hotel charges, receipts for jewelry she'd never received, a phone bill showing dozens of calls to the same number. "We need to talk," she said as Robert walked in. His face changed when he saw the papers on the table. First surprise, then guilt, then a calculated calmness that Diane had seen many times during his business negotiations. "What's all this?" he asked, setting down his briefcase. "Don't." Diane's voice was surprisingly steady. "Don't insult me by pretending. I know about her, Robert. I know about Jessica." Robert sank into the chair across from her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "How long have you known?" "Long enough." Diane took a sip of wine. "Is she pregnant?" Robert's head snapped up, shock clear on his face. "How did you?" "I followed you today. I heard you talking." Diane set down her glass carefully. "Are you leaving me for her?" Robert ran a hand over his face. He suddenly looked much older than his 45 years. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Diane." "That's not an answer." "I told her I would." Robert's voice was barely audible. "I told her I'd leave after the holidays." The pain that shot through Diane's chest was physical, as if he had stabbed her. 15 years of marriage ended in a sentence. "And the baby?" she asked, her voice cracking for the first time. "She thinks she's pregnant. It's not confirmed." Robert looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "I'm sorry, Diane. I never meant for any of this to happen." Diane laughed, a hollow sound that surprised even her. "You never meant to sleep with another woman? You never meant to get her pregnant? You never meant for me to find out?" She stood up, suddenly unable to sit across from him anymore. "I want you out of this house tonight. Call your lawyer tomorrow. Diane, please." "And Robert?" She turned back to him, her face hard. "Jessica should know what she's getting. Tell her to ask you about Karen Thompson from your office, and Melissa from the Chicago project, and how many others were there that I never found out about." Robert drove through the rain, his windshield wipers barely keeping up with the downpour. It was fitting weather for what he needed to do tonight. After Diane left, he had paced the empty house for hours, trying to think clearly. His life was falling apart around him. His wife knew everything. His mistress was possibly pregnant. His carefully constructed world was crumbling. He pulled up outside Jessica's apartment building just after 10 p.m. The lights were on in her window. Robert sat in his car for a long moment, rehearsing what he would say. He had to end things with Jessica. It was the only way to salvage anything from this mess. Maybe, if he begged, Diane would take him back. Maybe they could put their marriage back together. It wouldn't be easy, but it had to be better than the alternative: divorce, scandal, his reputation destroyed. Jessica opened her door wearing sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt. Her face was puffy, like she'd been crying. "I didn't think I'd see you tonight," she said, stepping back to let him in. "We need to talk." Robert's voice sounded strange even to his own ears. He walked past her into the small living room. "I know that tone," Jessica said, closing the door. "Something's happened." Robert turned to face her. "Diane knows about us." Jessica's eyes widened. "How?" "She followed me here today. She heard us talking." Robert ran a hand through his wet hair. "She heard about the baby." Jessica sank onto the couch. "What did she say?" "She's left me. She's calling a lawyer tomorrow." Robert paced the small room. "This is a disaster, Jessica, a complete disaster." "So what now?" Jessica's voice was small. Robert stopped pacing and looked at her. In the harsh overhead light, she seemed younger than ever, almost childlike in her oversized clothes. "I can't do this," he said finally. "I can't leave Diane. I can't destroy everything I've built." Jessica stared at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this has to end, you and me. It's over." The words came out harsher than he intended. Jessica stood up slowly. You promised me. Her voice trembled. You said you would leave her. You said we would be together. That was before everything blew up. Robert's voice rose. I have to try to fix my marriage. I have to. What about the baby? Jessica placed her hand on her stomach. Our baby? Robert felt a flash of anger. We don't even know if there's a baby. And if there is, how do I know it's mine? How do I know you haven't been seeing other men too? The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had crossed a line. Jessica's face went white with shock, then red with fury. Get out, she whispered. Jessica, I didn't mean. You think I've been sleeping around? Her voice rose. You think I'm the liar in this relationship? You're the one who hid a wife for 6 months. She grabbed a glass from the coffee table and threw it at him. It missed, shattering against the wall. You're the one who promised me a future when you never intended to give me one. Robert stepped toward her, hands raised. Calm down. Let's talk about this rationally. Rationally? Jessica laughed, a wild sound. There's nothing rational about any of this. You used me, Robert. You lied to me from day one. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. And now you're throwing me away because things got difficult. I'm not throwing you away, Robert said, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm trying to do the right thing. The right thing would have been not to start an affair in the first place. Jessica screamed. The right thing would have been to be honest with me from the beginning. She picked up a framed photo and threw it at him. This time, it hit him in the shoulder. Stop it. Robert grabbed her wrists as she reached for another object to throw. You're being hysterical. Jessica struggled against his grip. Let go of me. She kicked at his shins, catching him off guard. As he stumbled, she broke free and ran for her purse on the kitchen counter. I'm calling Diane, she said, pulling out her phone. I'm telling her everything. What? Robert lunged after her. No, you can't. Watch me. Jessica's fingers moved across her phone screen. I have her work number, from that magazine article. Panic surged through Robert. If Jessica called Diane, told her about the baby, about all the promises he had made, any chance of saving his marriage would be gone. Without thinking, he grabbed for the phone. Jessica pulled back, and they struggled for a moment, a bizarre tug of war. Give me the phone, Robert shouted. No. Jessica twisted away from him. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Robert's hand connected with Jessica's face. She stumbled backward, her head hitting the corner of the kitchen counter with a sickening thud. Then she crumpled to the floor, the phone clattering beside her. Robert sat in the witness stand, his once expensive suit now hanging loose on his frame after 6 months in jail awaiting trial. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators, all eager to hear the final testimony in what the media had dubbed the developer's downfall. In the front row, Diane watched him with cold, distant eyes. She had not spoken to him since the night she left their home. Mr. Wilson, the prosecutor said, pacing slowly in front of the jury, walk us through what happened after Ms. Miller fell. Robert cleared his throat. He had told this story so many times, to the police, to his lawyer, to the court psychiatrist. Each time, the events of that night felt more like a movie he had watched than something he had lived through. I checked for a pulse, he said, his voice hollow. There wasn't one. I panicked. I wiped down anything I might have touched. Then I left. You didn't call 911? The prosecutor asked, though she knew the answer. No, Robert admitted. I was scared. I wasn't thinking clearly. What did you do next? I went home. I showered. I burned the clothes I was wearing in our backyard fire pit. Robert stared at his hands. I told myself it was an accident, that I didn't mean to hurt her. The prosecutor nodded, then displayed a large photograph on the screen for the jury to see. It was Jessica's apartment. The blood still pooled on the kitchen floor. An accident you tried very hard to cover up. Robert had no answer for that. He looked up and accidentally caught Diane's eye. Her expression didn't change. No anger, no sadness, just emptiness. Somehow that was worse than hatred would have been. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence against Robert was overwhelming. Security cameras had captured him entering and leaving Jessica's building. His DNA was found under her fingernails. Most damning of all was his internet search history from the hours after Jessica's death. Accidental death, self-defense. How long before a body is found? Flights to Mexico. The media coverage was relentless. Every detail of Robert's double life was exposed and dissected. Former colleagues avoided reporters' questions. Friends claimed they had always sensed something off about him. The only person who refused to speak to the press was Deanne. On the day of the verdict, Robert stood with his head bowed as the jury foreman read the decision, guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 15 years to life. As the bailiff led him away, Robert looked back at the courtroom one last time. Diane was already gone. 5 years later, Robert sat in the prison visiting room, waiting. When the door opened, he barely recognized the woman who walked in. Diane's blonde hair was shorter now, and she moved with a confidence he didn't remember. She sat across from him without smiling. "Thank you for coming," Robert said. He had written to her every month for 5 years. This was the first time she had agreed to visit. "I'm not here for you," Diane said. "I'm here for me. My therapist thinks this will help me move on." Robert nodded. "How are you?" "I'm remarried," she said simply. "He's a good man. Honest." The words stung, but Robert accepted them. "I'm glad." "I have questions," Diane said, opening a small notebook. "Things I need to know before I can put this behind me completely." For the next hour, Robert answered everything she asked. When did the affair start? Why Jessica? Were there others? He told her the truth, all of it, holding nothing back. He owed her that much at least. As their time came to an end, Diane closed her notebook and looked at him directly. "Do you think about her, Jessica?" "Every day," Robert admitted. "Every night." Diane nodded. "So do I. I think about the life she should have had, the child that might have been born." Robert had not known Jessica was indeed pregnant until the autopsy results were released during the trial. 4 weeks along, the knowledge had haunted him every day since. "I'll never understand how you could do it," Diane said as she stood to leave. "Not the affair, people make that mistake all the time. But the lying, the double life, and then when it all fell apart, turning to violence instead of just facing the consequences." Robert had no answer. He had asked himself the same questions countless times in his prison cell. "Goodbye, Robert," Diane said. "I won't be coming back." "I know," he said. "Thank you for coming this once." After Diane left, a guard led Robert back to his cell. On his small metal desk was the novel he'd been reading and a photograph the prison psychiatrist had encouraged him to keep, his and Diane's wedding day, 15 years before it all went wrong. Robert turned the photo face down. Then he lay on his narrow bed and closed his eyes, knowing that like every night for the past 5 years, he would see Jessica's face as he drifted off to sleep.